about crows is that they didn't do anything wrong. Like, nobody actually told crows to hang around battlefields, execution grounds, and plague pits. They weren't scheming or being dramatic. They were just being birds. Specifically, scavengers. Which means they showed up wherever dead things were. Because dead things are food, and food is the entire point of life if you're a crow. And then humans watched them do this for centuries and decided the birds were evil. Which, okay, that's a lot to unpack. but this is actually the thing I keep coming back to. Because I think there's a storytelling lesson buried in here that nobody is really talking about clearly. It's not just crows are misunderstood. It's something weirder than that. It's about the mechanics of how a reputation gets built, how something becomes ominous, how a symbol gets created out of nothing but timing and human anxiety. And here's what annoys me. When people talk about using crows in stories, games, films, videos, art, they usually reach for the aesthetic. Ooh, dark bird, spooky, omen, death. Very gothic, very moody, perfect. But, okay, like visually, I get it. Totally get it, it works. The black feathers, the harsh call, the cold sky, that totally checks out. But if you're only using the crow as a vibe, well, you're missing the actual reason the vibe exists in the first place. And that reason is so much more useful to you as someone who creates. Because here's what actually happened. Crows are scavengers. That's just biology. They eat carrion, dead flesh. They're built for it. Their beaks are good at it. Their digestive systems handle it. It is the ecological role they fill. And what this means in practice is that wherever death is concentrated, be it a battlefield, a flood, a famine, a public execution, a vague village hit by disease, crows show up in enormous numbers. Not because death summoned them, but because death created the food source. And food sources attract animals built to eat them. That's it. That's the whole point. But humans, standing near that battlefield, watching those birds descend, didn't know that mechanism. They had never taken a biology class. They didn't have the framework for an ecological scavenging behavior. What they did have was pattern recognition, which is one of the most powerful and dangerous tools the human brain has ever developed. The pattern they see is tragedy happens, crows appear. Tragedy happens again, crows appear. Over and over across their entire lives, their parents' lives, and the stories they've been told since they were little kids. Tragedy and crows. Crows and tragedy. Sounds like a cool novel, by the way. And this is where it starts to get weird. The human brain doesn't just log patterns. It assigns casualty. It does this automatically without permission. You see two things happen together enough times, your brain treats them as linked. Not as a correlation you're aware of, but as a fact you feel in your bones. So, at some point, and I genuinely think this happens slowly over generations, at some point, people stopped thinking crows appear after death and started thinking crows appear before death. They inverted it. The causation flipped. The crows stopped being evidence that something had already happened and became a warning that something was going to. That's the problem. Because that's the exact moment where a bird becomes an omen. And nobody talks about this, but this pattern, the exact same pattern, is one of the most fundamental storytelling engines that exists. Because the entire apparatus of prophecy and fiction runs on this. You put an omen in a story, you're mimicking the exact cognitive error that made crows scary in the first place. You're exploiting the same wiring. The audiences see crows in the scene. They feel unease and they don't know why. They just know that feeling has been trained into them through centuries of inherited symbolism that started because a group of birds were hungry over a battlefield. Okay, hold on. Let me sit with that for a second. The reason a crow in the corner of a film frame makes you dread today, in a world where you know exactly what crows are and why they appear near death, is because generations of humans who didn't know that were so consistently scared that they encoded it into every story they told. And those stories taught the next generation to feel it. And it's been compounding ever since, well, before written language. You are responding to pre-irrational fear that was calibrated before anyone could understand. And that's wild because it means the symbol doesn't require the original mechanism to keep working. The crow doesn't need to actually show up near death for you to feel like it means death. The work is already done. It's pre-installed. And this is where people mess up when they try to use that inherited symbol in their own work. Because there's a difference between deploying a symbol and understanding why it works. And most creators, honestly, are just deploying. For the hell of it. They're not examining. They see the crows as ominous. So they put a crow in a scene, get the ominous hit, and move on. And it works. It does work. But it works in the same way a stock photo of a sunset works. It communicates the feeling technically, but it doesn't do anything else. The creators who actually understand the mechanism get to do something different. They complicate it. They invert it. They ask, what if this character actually knows what crows are? What if the character is the only one that knows? What does it feel like to watch an entire community interpret a natural event as supernatural when you understand what's actually happening? See, that's a completely different story, but it's all built on one image. And I think about a game doing this. Like, the bird appears, the player feels dread, but then the game rewards players who notice it's just a bird responding to something. The omen is real, but not for the reason everyone in the story thinks it is. That's so much more sophisticated use of the symbol. But you can only write that if you understand why that works in the first place. The symbol, that is. So let me talk about the feathers for a second, because I don't think this gets enough attention. So the feathers are black, and I want to ask, how much do you guys think the crow's reputation is actually just feather color anxiety? How much of that? Like, because across dozens of cultures and time periods, black is coded as death, night, the unknown, evil, mourning, absence. And that's not a universal truth about the color black. It's a cultural agreement that got built up over time. Partially because night is genuinely dangerous if you're a pre-industrial human without artificial light. And partially because death changes the color of things. It darkens, it drains, and black became associated with that color, with that change, sorry. So you have an animal that shows up near death, and it's also the color of death. Double encoding! Congratulations! See, the visual and behavioral reinforce each other. And once that double encoding is established in a cultural memory, it's almost impossible to separate. Which makes me wonder something. And I don't know the answer to this, so I'm super curious. Would crows still be the symbol of death if they were bright red or white? Like, if you had a white bird that was also a scavenger, would it also become an omen of death? Or would we have found a way to make its whiteness mean something else? Purity, perhaps? A white bird that shows up to clean away the dead? I think the feather color matters more than we give it credit for. But I also think that once a behavioral pattern is established, the symbol would have persisted even if the color changed. It just would have been a slower build. Okay, so Odin. I keep coming back to Odin's ravens, because not only are they super famous, but they're also a clear example of what happens when a culture decides to work with the intelligence of these birds rather than against it. And I'm going to butcher these names. I apologize in advance. Hugin and Munin, thought and memory. Two ravens who fly out every day and return with everything they've observed. They're Odin's surveillance system, basically. His intelligence network, his archive. They see everything. And this is interesting because it takes some animal that other cultures are afraid of, like the dark bird that appears at death and watches with what feels like intelligence, and it leans into that intelligence specifically. It doesn't ignore that the bird seems to understand things. It makes that the whole point. Odin's doesn't just have ravens because they're scary. He has ravens because they see. And here's what I quietly think is happening in that mythology. The same behavior reality is still underneath it. Ravens appear where death occurs. Odin is, after all, associated with war, battle, and death. His ravens appear at battles. The scavenger behavior is still the engine. But the cultural interpretation says these birds are here because they're reporting back, because they're gathering information, because wisdom sends them. See, the behavior is the same, but the meaning is completely different. And it's actually a fascinating storytelling example because it shows you how that image can carry opposite moral weight depending entirely on what you frame around it. The crow at the battlefield is either a demon or a divine messenger, and the difference is how you look at it. The framing, of course. And it's not a small thing. It's basically the entire job of a narrative. Now, Game of Thrones. Yes, I know. I had to put this in here. But I just couldn't. I'm sorry. I could not. Okay? Because the ravens in Game of Thrones are message carriers. They're the postal service. And there's this thing that gradually happens over the course of the book and the show where the ravens stop being neutral information and starts accumulating dread. because every time a raven arrives, something terrible has happened or is about to happen. A king dies, an army is marching, a betrayal is being revealed. See, the raven didn't change. Its function didn't change. But the narration kept associating ravens with bad news more and more, because the bad news kept coming and the ravens kept bringing it. The bird starts to code as ominous, even within a universe where it's just a messenger. And this is what annoys me. This is what the actual writer accidentally recreated the original psychological mechanism. See, real people saw crows at tragedy. Game of Thrones characters gets bad news via raven. Repeat it enough and the bird becomes the failing. Which, I mean, yeah, I guess the show didn't plan for the ravens to become symbols of dread. They were logistics, but the story created the same loop that ancient humans created in real life. That's just how it works. That's how symbols get made. It doesn't require intent. It requires repetition and proximity to strong emotions. So what does this mean for us creators? Well, this is where it starts to get fascinating, actually, because I think the crow isn't just a symbol you can use. It's a model for how symbols develop. And if you understand the model, you can build new ones. See, the crow became an omen because of a natural event that happened repeatedly near emotionally intense human experiences. And of course, the human brain doing what it does best connects them. Which means if you're building a world, a game, a story, a series, and you want to create a symbol that feels ominous, not just borrowed, not just I put a skull here ominous, well, you need to build repeated association into your narrative. You need your audience to experience the thing that feels neutral along emotional intensity. Enough times, though, that the thing itself starts carrying the weight. This is something that long form storytelling can do that single film storytelling struggles with. You can establish a visual or signal in episode 1 when nothing has happened yet. At least nothing bad. And then bring it back in episode 3, then episode 7, and by the time it fully appears in the finale, well, the audience is already afraid without knowing why. Because you trained them. The same way humans were trained by actual crows at battlefields. You can manufacture the psychological history of a symbol within a single narrative. That's not a small power flux. But here's the thing. And this is where I think the crow story gets uncomfortable if you follow it all the way through. See, the crows don't do anything wrong. I said that at the beginning, and I want to come back to it because I don't think we fully understand why it matters. So the crow shows up honestly. It responded to a real event. It did what its biology told it to do. And then humans built a century-long mythology of malevolence around it. The crow became the symbol of the thing it was only ever a witness to. And this is actually a pattern that shows up in storytelling all the time. The neutral witness being transformed through human projection into an active agent of the thing they witnessed. The scapegoat, the messenger who gets blamed for the message. The person who was present at the crime being treated as the cause of the crime. And what's crazy about the crow is that this happened at a civilization scale, across thousands of years, to an animal that frankly couldn't argue back, couldn't explain itself, couldn't say, I'm not causing this, I'm simply responding. There's a difference. It just keeps showing up at death because it always has, and it keeps getting blamed for it. Now, here's the thing I think about when I think about using crows in fiction, or any creature out there that carries inherited symbolism. There are two approaches, and I'm not saying one is better than the other. They're different, and most people don't consciously choose between them. So the first approach is to use the symbol as installed. The crow means death, unease, gothic. So you put that in your scene, and you get the cultural download for free. You're borrowing from the centuries of accumulated meaning, and it's okay. It's actually skillful if it's done with control. The second approach is when you interrogate the system within the work. You use the audience's trained response against them alongside, or you just reveal the mechanism. The crow appears ominous. The story questions whether omens are real. The character who understands why crows gather. What does that knowledge cost them? Does it comfort them or isolate them? See, the first approach is costume. The second approach, that's architecture. And I think most creators, most people building things, default to costume without realizing there's an architectural option. Not because they're lazy, because they were never shown the mechanism. They were just shown the symbol. Now, give me a sec, guys. So let me get into something that I find specifically interesting, which is the intelligence thing. So crows are famously smart, like objectively, measurably, disturbingly smart for birds. Sorry. Anyway, they use tools. They solve multi-step puzzles. They recognize human faces. They hold what research calls crow courts, gatherings where they seem to collectively respond to a member of their group who died. What looks like mourning behavior or social processing of death. And here's what annoys me. We know this now, and people find it fascinating and adorable, and there are YouTube videos with millions of views about crows' intelligence, and everybody is charmed by them. But I don't think we quite realize that that exact intelligence is what made crows terrifying for most of human history. Because before you have context, before you know what you're looking at, a bird that seems to understand things is not charming. It's wrong. It violates the expected relationship between humans and animals. Animals are supposed to be below us in the comprehension hierarchy. They're supposed to react and not observe. They're supposed to flee or attack, not watch with what looks like assessment. But crows? Crows watch, remember, communicate about specific humans with other crows. If a crow decides it doesn't like you, it'll tell its friends. This is documented behavior. And without the scientific framework and the words cognition or social learning, What do you call an animal that recognizes you, communicates about you, and remembers you? Well, you call it supernatural, of course, because the alternative raises too many uncomfortable questions about what intelligence means and who has it and why we've always assumed we're the only ones. I think Crow's intelligence is actually what dooms it, culturally more than anything else. See, stupid birds don't become omens, sorry. You don't have pigeon mythology about death. And pigeons are everywhere. Pigeons eat near humans constantly. Pigeons aren't scary because pigeons don't seem to notice you as an individual. They don't seem to be watching. Crows? Crows appear to watch. And once something does that, it immediately gets assigned intent. This is just the thing that happens in the human brain. Watching implies knowing. Knowing implies judgment. Judgment implies the possibility of punishment. You go from, that bird is looking to me, to, well, that bird's nothing to me, to, that bird knows something. Faster than any rational thought can intercept. And for a bird that's already appeared around death, that's already gathered in large groups that moved like coordinated units, that already sounded like it was mimicking language sometimes, adding apparent intelligence to that profile is not going to make humans feel better about it. It's going to make it worse. Of course it makes it worse. See, Poe's Raven. I want to talk about Poe's Raven. I love that. Love Poe. Anyway, because this is one of the most interesting transformations of the symbol. See, the raven in that poem is not supernatural. The narrator tells you it's not supernatural. He knows intellectually that it's a bird, that it was taught to say one word, and that doesn't know anything about his dead lover. He knows this, and he descends anyway. That's the poem. Not a supernatural creature haunts me. It's more, I haunt myself using a bird as an excuse. The raven doesn't do anything. It just sits there. It says nevermore. That's literally all it does in the entire thing. And the narrator builds an entire gothic hell out of his own psychology. And the bird just happens to be on the sidelines. And maybe this is the most honest use of crows as omen in all of literature, because Poe is essentially showing you the mechanism. He's showing you how a human projects meaning onto a neutral thing. He's not hiding it. The narrator is not confused about what the bird is. He just can't stop. Which is kind of terrifying, actually, because the super straightforward version of the story is less frightening, because in that version, the supernatural version of the story is less frightening, because in that version, the bird has power. In Poe's version, the bird has no power and the outcome is the same. That's the thing about human pattern recognition and grief and the need to assign meaning. It doesn't require the symbol to be real. It just requires the human brain to be in the right or wrong state. Okay, so here's something I want to actually address, because I think it matters for anyone building symbolic systems into their work. Why did some cultures make crows evil and others make them wise? Well, because it's not universal. I keep talking about the Western ominous crow, but that's not the only tradition. Just the one that I'm mostly familiar with. Like in some indigenous North American traditions, crow or raven is a creator, a trickster, a cultural hero, brings fire to the people, brings light, reshapes the world. In Japanese, you have the Yatagarasu. Could be saying that wrong. I apologize. A three-legged crow is a divine messenger associated with the sun, guidance, and divine intervention. In Norse mythology, as I've mentioned, you have Odin's ravens, where their wisdom made manifest. So that just begs the big question. Why the split? Like, what determines whether a culture decides the scavenger bird is aligned with death or with divine wisdom? Well, I think, and I could be wrong because I'm not a folklorist, but just take this as a thinking out loud observation. But I think the difference might partially come down to the relationship with death itself. Like cultures with a more integrated relationship with death, where it's part of a cycle rather than a rupture, might have had less need to pathologize animals that showed up near. After all, if death is not the enemy, then the thing that shows up near death is not an omen of catastrophe. It's just a participant in the natural process of things, which is literally what a scavenger is. But, sorry. But if death is terror, if death is the ultimate interruption, and is something that happens to you rather than something you're a part of, then anything associated with it becomes tainted. And the crow is very, very associated with it. So the crow is sort of a cultural Rorschach test. What do you do with it tells you something about what you think about death. And I keep wondering what this specifically means for environmental storytelling, because crows are one of the most efficient pieces of environmental exposition that exist. Like, you can communicate so much with a single crow. Like a crow on a fence post in the afternoon light is just a bird. A crow on a grave marker in the fog is Gothic shorthand. A crow in an otherwise empty landscape after what's implied to have been a battle, well, you don't need to show the bodies. The bird tells you what was here. And that's what I think creators miss a lot. That the crow only works if the audience has the cultural context. If you're creating for an international audience or a young audience that hasn't absorbed the symbolism the same way, then you won't get the automatic read. You might need to build it a little. And that's what's really awesome, is because it forces you to think about how you earn symbolic weight rather than assuming you have it. Because you can't always borrow from the cultural deposit. Sometimes you have to make your own deposit first. Which is beyond annoying, by the way. As a creative person, I find it annoying that inherited symbolism is not a universal bank that you can just draw from. Wish it was. But I think we need to treat it more like regional currency. It works in certain places, and in other places you have to exchange first. And this means that a smart creator using crows is asking, does my audience have this? And if they're not sure, then they're building the association into the work before they spent it. The most sophisticated version of this I can think of is when a creator establishes the emotional weight of a specific image early in the work. in a context that isn't scary yet, so that by the time they get in a scary context, then the audience had been trained. The crow appears in a good scene, just briefly, then a sad one, just as briefly. And then the third time it appears, the audience feels it without knowing why. Because the work has been depositing into the account. That is what patient storytelling is. And it requires trusting your audience to absorb things without being told what to feel. Okay. But here's the thing I keep circling back to, and I can't quite land clearly. See, the crow's reputation is essentially a case study in what happens when the right creature ends up in the wrong frame. Everything about the crow is accurate. It's intelligent. It does gather near death. It does remember individual humans. It does communicate in ways that feel sophisticated. None of those observations that led to the mythology are wrong. The conclusions are wrong, or, well, okay. Not wrong exactly, but the reasoning that connects the observations to the conclusions has a gap in it. A gap that says, well, this creature appears near death. Therefore, this creature is associated with death in some supernatural or intentional way. Which, that gap though, okay, that gap is the scavenger explanation. Unfortunately, once you feel that gap, the mythology collapses. It just becomes a bird being a bird. But here's what I find interesting about this. The mythologies didn't collapse when people learned more about crows. Like, it didn't disappear when naturalists started explaining scavenger behavior. It didn't go away when science gave us ecology. People kept putting crows in Gothic literature, in dark fantasy, and using crows as ominous imagery in horror games, haunted houses, and Halloween decor. We know now, and we still feel it. Which means that the symbol has fully detached from the original mechanism. Because it doesn't need it anymore. It is self-sustaining at this point. The fear is the self-referential point. Because people are afraid of crows as symbols because they were taught to be afraid of crows as symbols. The original ecological accident that started the whole thing is just background radiation. And now people are treating the aesthetic weight of crows as if it were intentional, as if someone designed it, as if the crow's reputation was a deliberate artistic choice rather than the residue of pre-scientific recognition and collective fear. Which is interesting, because the crow is now carrying artistic meaning it never earned through artistic means. It earned it by showing up honestly at the worst points of human history. And we called it evil for that. Anyway. That's just where I'm at with it. The crow showed up, did its job, got blamed for everything that was already happening, and we turned it into a symbol of death so thoroughly that even now, knowing all that we know, even sitting here having thought about it through, If I were to put a crow in the corner of a dim room in a story, you would feel something. We all would, including me. That's either impressive or kind of embarrassing. I'm not sure which. Anyway, yeah. So if this made you think, like the video, subscribe if you want more stuff like this. This is WriteSparky, and I will see you in the next video.